If you have ever watched someone you love be disrespected by a person who was supposed to protect them and felt completely powerless to stop it. This story is going to hit differently. Like this video right now and subscribe to this channel, because what Steve Harvey said to one husband on live national television is something that needed to be said in a lot of living rooms across this country a long time ago. Let's get into it. There is a particular kind of man who uses humor as a weapon and calls it personality, who reduces the people closest to him to the butt of a joke and then, when the room goes quiet, looks around as though the problem is everyone else's sensitivity, who has been getting away with it for so long, at dinner tables, at family gatherings, at every social occasion where an audience was available, that he has entirely lost the ability to see it for what it is. On a warm Wednesday afternoon in a television studio in Los Angeles, that kind of man walked onto the Family Feud stage. His name was Dale Hutchinson. He was 51 years old, broadly smiling, and entirely comfortable in front of cameras. He had been married to his wife Beverly for 23 years. Her family, the Warners, a large, close-knit family from rural Tennessee, had been the subject of his humor for most of those 23 years. Beverly had grown up watching her mother absorb those jokes in silence. She had grown up watching her brothers clench their jaws and say nothing for the sake of family peace. She had grown up watching her father, a man who had worked the same stretch of farmland for 40 years and raised 5 children with unwavering dignity, be described by her husband as a simple country man, without Dale ever once pausing to consider what those words cost. What she had not grown up expecting was Steve Harvey, and what Dale Hutchinson had certainly not prepared for was the moment Steve Harvey stopped the pre-game introductions, looked him directly in the eye, and declined to let it pass. Beverly Warner Hutchinson was born the second of 5 children in Cookeville, Tennessee, 48 years before she stood on that stage. Her father, Earl Warner, had farmed the same land his own father had farmed, corn, soybeans, a small cattle operation that never made anyone wealthy but kept the family fed and the bills paid with a consistency that required, though few people outside farming understand this, an extraordinary combination of physical endurance, practical intelligence, and the kind of calm under pressure that most corporate boardrooms would pay considerably to bottle. Her mother, June, had raised 5 children, managed the household accounts, run the roadside vegetable stand from May to October every year for 3 decades, served as treasurer of the local church for 15 years, and somehow, through all of it, maintained the particular warmth that made the Warner home the house that every child in the surrounding neighborhood found reasons to be in. Beverly had absorbed everything about both of them. Her father's steadiness, her mother's warmth, the understanding, instilled early and never revised, that a person's worth had nothing whatsoever to do with their postcode or their paycheck. She had studied accounting at Tennessee Tech, moved to Nashville after graduation, and built a career as a bookkeeper for a regional construction company where she had worked for 21 years. She was the kind of employee who knew where every dollar was, remembered every invoice, and had the trust of every contractor who had ever needed to know that the numbers were right. She was, in every professional and personal sense, a person of complete reliability. She met Dale Hutchinson at a work conference in Nashville when she was 25. He was in sales, commercial office supplies, and he was immediately and comprehensively charming, funny, quick, socially at ease in any room. Beverly, who had grown up in a household where humor was gentle and warmth was the primary currency, found his energy attractive in the way that qualities you do not naturally possess often appear attractive from the outside. The jokes about her family began early, not cruelly, never, in Dale's framing, cruelly, just observationally. Her father's accent, her brother's preference for hunting over what Dale called more sophisticated recreation, the size of the family gatherings, which he attended with the visible discomfort of a man who had grown up in a smaller, quieter household and found the Warner volume and collectiveness overwhelming in ways he processed through mockery rather than honesty. In the early years of the marriage, Beverly had occasionally pushed back and Dale had occasionally adjusted, but the dynamic calcified over time as dynamics do when neither party forces a reckoning. The jokes became a feature of who Dale was in social settings. The Warners became a recurring bit. Earl Warner had said very little about it over the years. He was not a man who spent energy on things he could not change, but Beverly's oldest brother, Curtis, had quietly made clear to Beverly on more than one occasion that it was not a small thing to him, and that the only reason he continued to show up at family gatherings that included Dale was because she was his sister and his loyalty to her outweighed his objection to her husband. Beverly had heard that and carried it, in the way women carry things that belong in a conversation they have not yet managed to have. The Family Feud application was Beverly's idea, and its purpose was more considered than it appeared on the surface. She wanted her family on that stage. Her parents, her brother Curtis, her daughter Maya. She wanted them somewhere public and affirming, somewhere the cameras would look at them and see what she had always seen. Dignity, warmth, and the kind of deep competence that does not advertise itself. She also wanted Dale there, in that context, where his usual performance would have no comfortable audience and no easy exit. She had not planned what happened, but she had, perhaps, made it possible. The Hutchinson, Warner family arrived at the studio on a Wednesday morning. Beverly, Dale, their 20-year-old daughter Maya, Beverly's brother Curtis, and Beverly's mother June, who was 71 years old, and had dressed for the occasion with the careful attention of a woman who understood that some days deserved your best effort. Earl Warner had been unable to travel due to a hip replacement he was recovering from, and his absence sat quietly with Beverly throughout the morning. She had wanted him there. She had wanted him to be in the room for whatever the day produced. The family they were facing was the O'Caffer family from Houston. 5 members, all of them warm and loud and immediately beloved by the studio crew during the warm-up period. They had an ease between them that was entirely natural, the shorthand of people who have navigated enough of life together that they no longer need to explain themselves to each other. The production staff later noted that the pre-show energy in the Hutchinson, Warner group was noticeably different. June was warm and engaged, Curtis was steady and watchful, Maya was enthusiastic, and Beverly had the particular composure of someone who is conserving something for later. Dale was, as always, performing. Steve Harvey's pre-game introductions were, as usual, where the texture of each family surfaced. He worked through the O'Caffer family first, drawing out the warmth and the jokes with his characteristic ease. Then he turned to the Hutchinson Warners. He reached June first, asked her name, where she was from, how she felt about being on the show. June said she had watched Family Feud every weekday for 11 years and had been waiting a long time for her turn. The audience responded with immediate affection. Steve grinned. He asked Maya, who was sharp and funny, and delivered a line about her mother's cooking that got the room. He reached Curtis, who was brief and dry in the way that quietly confident men are brief and dry, and then he reached Beverly. Beverly told him about her family. She spoke about her parents with the directness of someone who has decided, for today at least, to say the true thing rather than the easy thing. Her father had farmed the same land for 40 years. Her mother had run a household and a business and a community position simultaneously for 3 decades. She said it plainly, without sentiment, in the tone of someone presenting facts that deserve to be heard as facts rather than as a heartwarming backstory. Steve listened with visible attention. Then he reached Dale. Dale introduced himself easily. Sales, 23 years of marriage, big family gatherings. Then, unprompted and with the easy confidence of a man who had deployed this material many times before, he said, Beverly's family, you know, they're good people, salt of the earth, but let's just say dinner conversation at the Warner house is a little different to what I grew up with. You know the type, everybody talking, nobody listening, every story takes 45 minutes. He laughed. It was a practiced laugh, the laugh of a man who expects the room to follow him. The room did not follow him. There was a small, uncomfortable ripple of laughter from a few audience members, the sound a crowd makes when it is uncertain whether something was meant to be funny or whether something just happened. Curtis looked at the floor. June's expression did not change, but something in it closed slightly. Beverly looked straight ahead with the stillness of a woman who has been here before and has already calculated, in real time, every available response and chosen none of them. Steve Harvey did not laugh. He did not move on. He tilted his head very slightly to one side and looked at Dale with the specific quality of attention that signals, to anyone who has spent time watching him work, that something is about to be examined rather than passed over. "Say that again for me," Steve said. His voice was even and unhurried. Dale, still smiling, still entirely unaware that the ground had shifted, repeated the substance of the joke with slightly less confidence this time. The repetition, stripped of the element of surprise, revealed it for what it was more plainly than the first delivery had. Steve looked at him for a moment, then he looked down the line at June, then at Curtis, then back at Dale. "Let me ask you something," Steve said, still in the same even tone. "That woman right there," he gestured toward June, Beverly's mother. "What is her name?" "June," Dale said. "June, right? And Beverly just told me that June has been running a roadside business, managing her household, and serving her community for over 30 years. Did you know that about your mother-in-law?" Dale blinked. "I mean, yeah, she does her stand, the vegetables, her business," Steve said. Not loudly, simply, "That is a business. 30 years is not a hobby, and Beverly's father, 40 years on the same land, that is not a simple man. That is a man who showed up to the same hard job for 40 years and did not quit. Do you understand how few people in this country can say that?" The studio was very quiet. "I'm not trying to embarrass you," Steve continued, and his tone made clear that he meant this precisely. "I want to ask you a genuine question, man to man. When you make those jokes about Beverly's family, and I am going to guess this is not the first time, do you think about what it costs her to hear them?" Dale opened his mouth, closed it. The smile, the professional social ease that had carried him through 23 years of dinner tables and family gatherings and office parties, was entirely absent. He looked, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, like a man without a prepared answer. I don't think I meant it like that," he said finally. "I know you didn't," Steve said. "That is exactly what I am talking about. You didn't think about it, but she has been thinking about it. For a long time." He looked at Beverly, who was looking back at him with an expression that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but something that sat between the two. The expression of a person who has finally heard something said out loud that they had only ever heard in their own head. "Isn't that right?" Steve asked her gently. Beverly nodded once. She did not speak. She did not need to. The weight of the room. What followed was one of those moments that live television occasionally produces and can never manufacture on purpose. A genuine reckoning between people in front of witnesses, unscripted and unrehearsed, with all the awkwardness and authenticity that implies. Dale stood in the center of the stage looking at his wife and his mother-in-law and his brother-in-law, and the distance between who he believed himself to be and who he was being shown to be was visible on his face in real time. Curtis was looking at him now, not angrily. That was the detail that the cameras caught and that audiences noticed on repeat viewings. Not with the accumulated resentment of a man who had been waiting for this moment. With a kind of quiet, exhausted recognition, the expression of a person who has been hoping, for years, that a conversation would eventually happen and is not entirely sure, now that it is happening, how to feel about the timing. June, for her part, reached out and placed a hand briefly on Beverly's arm. It was a small gesture. 2 seconds, perhaps 3. But it was the gesture of a mother who has been watching her daughter carry something and is acknowledging, in the only language available in that moment, that she has always known it was there. Steve allowed the moment to breathe. He did not rush to resolution or reach for warmth prematurely. He understood, and this is, perhaps, the most underappreciated of his considerable skills as a host, that some moments require their full weight before they can be moved through. Then he turned back to Dale. "What do you want to say to your wife right now?" he asked. "Not to me, not to the audience, to her." Dale looked at Beverly for a long moment. When he spoke, the performance was entirely gone. "I'm sorry," he said. I think I didn't understand what I was doing, but that's not an excuse. I'm sorry, Bev, and I'm sorry to your mum, And Curtis, he looked down the line. I've been doing that for a long time, and I should have stopped a long time ago. Beverly looked at him for a moment with the measuring gaze of a woman who has learned to take her time before accepting something. Then she said, quietly, "Thank you. Not forgiveness. Not yet, and perhaps that was honest too. But acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that something real had just been offered." Steve Harvey nodded slowly. Then, with the deliberate warmth of a man returning a room to equilibrium after something genuine has passed through it, he said, "All right. Now, are we ready to play some Family Feud?" The applause that followed was the warmest the studio had produced all day. The Hutchinson Warners won the main game. The victory was built primarily on the contributions of Beverly, Curtis, and Maya, who played with the combined focus of a family that had been given something to play for beyond the game itself. June buzzed in at one critical moment and gave the #1 answer on a question about things you find in a grandmother's kitchen, which brought the studio to its feet with the particular enthusiasm reserved for moments when an older person is seen and celebrated rather than merely tolerated. Dale played quietly and contributively, without the social performance of the pre-game period. He was not trying to win the room anymore. He was trying to help his family win the game. It was, all things considered, a better version of how to be in a group than the one he had arrived with. For fast money, Curtis went first. He was measured and instinctive in equal proportion and scored 144 points. That left Beverly needing just 56 from 5 questions. When she stepped to the podium, the studio had the particular quality of attention that an audience extends to someone it has come to care about during the course of a taping. "How are you feeling?" Steve asked. Beverly thought about it for exactly 1 second. "Like myself," she said, "which is how I always feel when I'm with my family." The audience responded. Steve smiled the smile of a man who appreciates a well-landed line. "Then let's play. Name something a family passes down through generations." Beverly answered without a pause. Values. The board turned. #1 answer, 41 points. The studio applauded, and June, standing at the side of the stage, pressed both hands to her chest. Name something that makes a house feel like a home. A half second. Family cooking. #1 answer, 38 points. The points were accumulating faster than needed, but the room was not watching the scoreboard. Name a quality that working people have more of than most. Beverly did not hesitate. Toughness. #2 answer, 27 points. Solid. The 20,000 was already theirs, but the round had taken on its own momentum. Name something people don't appreciate until it's gone. Beverly looked at the board. Then, quietly and with complete certainty, their roots. #1 answer, 44 points. The audience erupted. Curtis nodded slowly from the side of the stage, a single deliberate nod that said more than a speech. Last question. Name something that describes a person who comes from a simple background but builds something great. Beverly Hutchinson stood at the podium and looked at the question on the board and thought, in that moment, about her father in his farmhouse in Tennessee watching the show on the television her brothers had set up for him. She thought about 40 years on the same land, about June's vegetable stand, about Curtis's jaw, clenched and released at 100 dinner tables, about everything her family had built and endured and continued to show up for without ever being told it was worth showing up for by anyone who was supposed to matter. "Self-made," she said. The board flipped. #1 answer, 46 points. The studio came entirely apart. June was crying. Maya had both arms around her grandmother. Curtis covered his face with one hand briefly, then took it away, and the expression underneath was one that the cameras caught and that many people who watched would later say was the most moving image of the entire episode. A man who had been quietly absorbing something for a very long time, finally being allowed to put it down. Dale Hutchinson stood at the edge of the stage and watched his wife's family and said nothing. His expression was not readable in a single way. It was the expression of a man in the early stages of understanding something about himself that he will spend considerably more time with later, in private, when the cameras are gone and there is no performance available. Steve Harvey waited for the room to settle. Then he turned to the cameras with the directness he uses when he wants to make sure something lands not just in the studio but in living rooms. I want to say something about what happened today. Because I think it is important. There are families in this country, working families, farming families, families who built everything they have with their hands over decades, who get treated like their lives are lesser, like the fact that they did not have a certain kind of career or a certain kind of address means their story is not worth telling. That is wrong. It has always been wrong. And one of the things I have learned in this job, talking to thousands of families from every background and every part of this country, is that the families that built things quietly, without recognition, without applause, over 40 and 50 years, those families have more real substance in them than most people will ever understand. He paused to let it land. The studio was still. June and Earl Warner raised 5 children on a farm in Tennessee. They kept their word. They showed up. They are still showing up. That is not a punchline. That is a life well lived. And the people who share that life, the sons and daughters and grandchildren who carry those values forward, they deserve to be spoken of with respect, in public and in private, at dinner tables and on television stages, always. He turned to Dale one final time. Not in accusation. The earlier conversation had already done that work. He looked at him the way a man looks at someone he has chosen to believe is capable of being better than he has been. You have a good family, Dale. All of them, including the ones who came before your wife. I hope today is the beginning of you understanding that. Dale nodded. It was a different nod than the ones he had given earlier in the day, less managed, less smooth. It was the nod of someone receiving something rather than deflecting it. The episode aired 5 weeks after taping. The clip of Steve Harvey's pre-game exchange with Dale and the fast money round that followed reached 8 million views within 24 hours of broadcast. By the end of the week it had climbed to 17 million. Shared most widely not in the communities that typically circulate game show content, but in the ones that the moment had most directly addressed. Working families, rural communities, the children and grandchildren of farmers and tradespeople, and small business owners who recognized in Beverly's story something they had never previously seen named on television. The comment that appeared most frequently across platforms was a variation of the same sentiment. I have never heard someone on national television say that my family's life was worth something. The consistency of that response across thousands of individual comments, from people with no connection to each other or to the Hutchinson, Warner family, said something about a gap that the episode had briefly filled. The gap between the lives that receive cultural validation and the lives that build the country quietly without it. What changed for the family? The changes inside the Hutchinson, Warner family were not immediate or dramatic. That would not have been consistent with who any of them were. But they were real, and they were sustained, and they were described by Beverly in the single substantial interview she gave 6 months after the episode as the most significant shift in her marriage in a decade. The jokes stopped. Not gradually. Dale stopped making them. And he did not substitute other versions of the same thing, which was the outcome Beverly had always privately worried about. Whenever she had imagined this conversation happening, he stopped because he had been made to look at what the jokes had cost, in public, in front of his wife and her family, and that particular kind of accounting, done in daylight, with witnesses, is very difficult to walk away from unchanged. The Thanksgiving following the taping was, by Beverly's account, the most comfortable family gathering they had shared in years. Dale sat with Curtis for the better part of an afternoon during which, Beverly understood without being told the details, something had been said between them that both men had needed to say for a long time. She did not ask what it was. Curtis came to dinner that evening with the particular ease of a man who has put something down, and that was enough for her to know the broad shape of what had happened. Earl Warner, who had watched the episode at home in Tennessee during his hip recovery, called Beverly the morning after it aired. He did not say much. He was not a man who said much. He told her she had done them proud. He told her her mother had cried, which Beverly knew because June had also called. And then, before he hung up, he said, "That Harvey fella. He got it right." Coming from Earl Warner, who had spent 40 years in a profession that rewarded understatement, This was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Steve Harvey on Working People. In the months following the episode, Steve Harvey addressed the themes of his speech in several contexts. He was expansive and specific about what had moved him to intervene in the pre-game introduction. Not the joke itself, which he had heard variations of many times over the years, but the particular configuration of the room when he heard it. June at one end of the line, Beverly in the middle. Curtis's jaw. "I grew up watching the adults around me work," he said in one interview. "Not in offices. With their hands, their backs, their time. And I learned early that the people who work that way are not less intelligent, not less sophisticated, not less worthy of respect than people who work in suits. They are differently placed by circumstance and often by birth. That is all. The work is just as hard. The character required is just as significant. The lives built are just as real." He was also precise about the specific harm of the kind of humor Dale had been deploying. It is not just a joke. When you make a joke at someone's family's expense, not once, as a moment of poorly judged humor, but as a habit, as a recurring bit you have been doing for 20 years. You are doing something structural. You are telling your partner, repeatedly, that the people who made them are less than. And if you do it for long enough, in enough rooms, in front of enough people, it begins to function as an argument. An argument that the other person has to fight silently, alone, every single time. That is not teasing. That is erosion. The word erosion was picked up widely in the coverage that followed. Therapists used it. Writers used it. It appeared in discussions of the episode across publications that did not normally cover game show television, because it named something precisely that had not previously been named precisely in a public forum. The Warners. 1 year on 12 months after the taping, Earl Warner had recovered fully from his hip replacement and was back on the farm. June's vegetable stand had its best season on record. A surge in customers who had seen the episode and made the drive to Cookeville specifically to buy from the woman they had watched on television. June did not seek the attention, but she managed it with the grace of a woman who has spent decades making strangers feel welcome. The extra revenue funded a new polytunnel that expanded the growing season. Earl had helped build it. Beverly spoke about her parents in the interview with an openness she had not previously permitted herself in public. She described what it had meant to her, over the years of the marriage, to feel unable to defend them fully, to always be managing 2 relationships at once, translating between her husband and her family, absorbing the cost of the gap between them. And she described what it had felt like, on that stage in Los Angeles, to hear someone else say the things she had been saying privately for 23 years. "I did not go on that show to change my marriage," she said. "I went because I wanted my family somewhere that would look at them properly. The rest of it, Dale's apology, Steve's speech, all of it, I did not plan that. But I needed it, and I think Dale needed it. Sometimes you need a room full of strangers to reflect something back to you before you can see it clearly." The lesson at the center of this story, the humor Dale Hutchinson used for 23 years, was not exceptional. It was ordinary. It is deployed every day in living rooms and at dinner tables and in the corners of family gatherings across the country by people who have genuinely never considered what it costs. That ordinariness is precisely what made the episode resonate so widely. Beverly's experience was not rare. The specific mechanism of the harm, jokes used as a quiet, sustained form of condescension toward a partner's origins, is among the most common and least examined relationship dynamics that exist. What Steve Harvey did was not dramatic in its execution. He asked a man to repeat himself. He named what he had heard. He asked a question that required a real answer. He gave a woman back the dignity of having her family described accurately, in public, by someone with a microphone. None of those actions required exceptional resources. They required only the refusal to let the moment pass unremarked. Beverly's 5 fast money answers remain, for many people who watched that day, the emotional core of the episode, not because they were unusual answers, but because each one was drawn from something specific and real: values, family, cooking, toughness, their roots. Self-made. 5 words that described one family in Cookeville, Tennessee, and simultaneously described tens of millions of families across the country, who have never heard their lives described on television as something to be proud of rather than something to be excused. Earl Warner watched those answers from his armchair in Tennessee and said nothing for a long time after the credits rolled. Then June came in from the kitchen and sat beside him, and he reached over and took her hand. They had been married for 52 years. They did not need to say what the afternoon had meant. They already knew their roots. That was the answer Beverly gave when Steve Harvey asked her to name something people do not appreciate until it is gone. Number 1 answer, 44 points. And in a farmhouse in Cookeville, Tennessee, a man who had kept his word for 52 years and never once asked to be celebrated heard his daughter say it on national television and understood, for the first time in a long time, that it had been heard.